The weight of unspoken truths. There are moments when silence feels louder than screams. In the small apartment at the edge of the city, silence had become the most oppressive presence of all. The air seemed heavy, stagnant, as if every breath carried with it something unspoken, something poisonous that lingered between the walls and seeped into the furniture. It was the kind of silence that no sound could fully break, a silence born not of peace, but of suffocated words and fractured trust. Elena sat alone in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if holding them together could prevent the unraveling she felt inside. She stared at the shadows moving across the floor, distorted by the dim light filtering through the blinds. The city outside was alive, cars humming, footsteps echoing, voices rising and fading, but none of it seemed to touch her. The world was moving forward while she remained caught in an endless pause, circling a truth she could not yet bring herself to confront. For months, Elena had sensed something shifting in her life, though no single moment had announced the change. It was not the sharp break of a storm, but the slow, insidious seep of water into stone, eroding, reshaping. Her marriage, once marked by warmth and a rhythm of quiet understanding, had become brittle. Every gesture carried a weight it hadn't before. Every glance seemed to conceal more than it revealed. What unsettled her most was not the possibility of betrayal itself, but the gnawing uncertainty, the inability to know whether the fracture lay in her husband's heart or only in her own imagination. Doubt, once a whisper at the edge of her thoughts, had grown into something monstrous, feeding on her every hesitation. It was there when she lay awake at night, her body turned away from his, her mind rehearsing conversations she never spoke aloud. It was there when she scrolled through messages on her phone, searching for patterns in the simplest of words, convinced they contained codes she could not yet decipher. It was there when she stood in front of the mirror, searching her own reflection for signs of inadequacy, as though her very being might be the source of whatever distance had emerged. And yet, on the surface, nothing catastrophic had happened. There were no confessions, no confrontations, no undeniable proof. Only fragments, his late nights explained by work, his brief distractions dismissed as stress, his silences rationalized as exhaustion. To anyone else, their lives might still look perfectly intact. To Elena, however, each day felt like a balancing act on a rope stretched thin, where the smallest tremor might send her falling into a truth she both dreaded and craved. The most dangerous part was the allure of the unknown. The possibility that behind his quietness lay something hidden, something that might explain everything or ruin everything. She feared it, but she also felt drawn to it, as if discovering the truth would finally release her from the purgatory of not knowing. That night, as she sat alone in the dim room, she felt the weight of inevitability. A moment was coming, she could sense it, when silence would no longer be enough, when the unanswered questions would demand to be spoken. But she also knew that once the silence was broken, nothing could be the same again. This was not a story about betrayal in its simple, obvious form. It was a story about perception, about the mind's ability to twist shadows into shapes, about how the fear of losing someone can sometimes destroy the very bond it seeks to protect. Elena did not yet realize it, but she was already at the threshold of unraveling, standing at the edge of a truth that would alter not only her marriage, but her understanding of herself. Because sometimes the most devastating betrayals are not the ones committed by others, but the ones whispered by our own minds. Elena had not always been this way. There had been a time when she was certain, steady, anchored. She remembered the early days of her relationship with Adrian, when even silence between them had been warm, filled with the comfort of shared presence. They had met in the most ordinary of ways, introduced by friends at a quiet gathering, a night when conversation flowed more easily than it had any right to. Adrian had seemed composed, thoughtful, the kind of man who noticed details others overlooked. The way someone held a glass, the cadence of a laugh, the tilt of a head that betrayed a mood at its first. His attention had felt like a gift, as if he were offering her a mirror in which she could finally see herself clearly. Elena had always been introspective, a little reserved, someone who tended to dwell on the inner world more than the outer. With him, she felt understood, as though he could read what she struggled to say. Their relationship had been a rhythm of long walks, quiet dinners, shared books and ideas. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, yet somehow profound in its simplicity. Marriage had followed almost naturally, not as a sudden leap, but as a continuation of that rhythm. They built a life together in the apartment she now found suffocating, arranging furniture not only for function but for the sense of belonging it gave them. There had been late nights spent cooking together, mornings punctuated by the scent of coffee and the rustle of newspapers. They had lived, not in grand gestures, but in the small rituals that stitched their lives together. But routines, once comforting, have a way of transforming. Over time, those same rituals began to feel less like connection and more like obligation. Where once they lingered over meals, now they ate quickly, distracted. Where once silence between them felt intimate, now it carried sharp edges, suggesting things unsaid. Elena often wondered whether the change was in him, or if it was in herself, eroded by her own doubts. Her childhood offered no roadmap for clarity. She had grown up in a house where appearances mattered more than truths, where her parents' arguments were muffled behind closed doors, never acknowledged yet always felt. From her mother, she had inherited the skill of reading between lines, of sensing tension without words. From her father, she had inherited silence, the kind that builds walls instead of bridges. It was no wonder, then, that uncertainty became unbearable for her. She had learned to live in it, but never to resolve it. Adrian's background was different. Raised in a small town, he carried with him a kind of quiet resilience, shaped by years of simplicity and responsibility. His parents had been steady, practical people, teaching him to approach life with patience, to endure rather than react. He was not quick to anger, not prone to sudden bursts of emotion. For Elena, this had once been his greatest strength. Now, it was his most confounding trait. When he withdrew into silence, she could not tell whether it meant peace or concealment. The contrast between their inner worlds, once a source of balance, had begun to tilt into imbalance. Elena, with her instinct to probe and interpret, found herself digging deeper into his silences, constructing meanings he might never have intended. Adrian, with his habit of retreating inward, offered fewer explanations, not out of cruelty, but from an assumption that words were unnecessary. Each of them, in their own way, was convinced they understood the other. Yet beneath the surface, misunderstanding grew like cracks in the foundation of their home. From the outside, their life still appeared enviable. Friends saw them as stable, steady, the couple who had avoided the turbulence others endured. Even Elena's closest confidants could not fully grasp her unease. When she tried to explain, it sounded vague, intangible, like smoke slipping through her fingers. But inside her, the unease was anything but vague. It gnawed at her constantly, a low hum of dread that made even the simplest moments feel weighted. Her nights became the most difficult. Lying beside Adrian, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, she found herself caught between yearning and suspicion. Sometimes she wanted to reach out, to close the space between them with the touch of her hand. Other times she lay stiff, her mind racing through imagined scenarios. His late hours at work, the distracted look in his eyes, the way he sometimes seemed far away even when he was right beside her. The longer she lingered in these thoughts, the more the line between reality and imagination blurred. Was he hiding something, or was she constructing shadows from her own insecurities? The question itself became unbearable, for each possibility was equally devastating. To be betrayed would shatter her trust, but to be wrong, to have accused him silently, day after day, of sins he had not committed, would mean she had betrayed herself. In this quiet war of perception, the apartment became a battlefield without words. Every glance, every pause, every sigh felt like a move in a game neither of them admitted they were playing. And Elena, whether she wanted to or not, was preparing herself for the moment when the silence would finally break, when the truth, whatever shape it took, would stand before her. Because nothing corrodes a relationship more swiftly than the suspicion of a lie, and nothing torments the mind more deeply than not knowing if the suspicion is true. It began with the smallest of things. A forgotten detail in a story he told about his day. A hesitation before answering a simple question. A smile that seemed to flicker and vanish too quickly. To Adrian, these were nothing, normal, fleeting moments of human imperfection. To Elena, they became evidence, pieces of a puzzle that only she could see. Her mind, once her refuge, had turned against her. It replayed scenes relentlessly, dissecting them, rearranging them, demanding an answer, where none existed. She found herself retracing his movements, not physically, but in memory. What time had he left for work yesterday? What did he say about lunch with colleagues? Did his tone shift when he mentioned someone's name? Each detail became a thread she pulled at obsessively, hoping to unravel a hidden pattern. Adrian's long hours at the office, once a sign of his dedication, now seemed suspicious. She began to watch the clock when he was late, her chest tightening with each passing minute. When he arrived home, weary and quiet, she felt both relief and fresh unease. Relief that he was there, unease that she could not shake the feeling of something unspoken clinging to him like a shadow. Her thoughts soon spilled into her daily life. At work, she struggled to focus, her mind wandering back to the unanswered questions. Conversations with friends became difficult, for she feared slipping and revealing the turmoil that consumed her. Even in moments of solitude, walking through the park, reading a book, she found no peace. Every quiet space became another chamber for her doubts to echo. What made it worse was Adrian's calmness. His demeanor did not change. He was patient, thoughtful, occasionally distant, but never cold. There was no outburst, no evidence, no confrontation. His steadiness, which once soothed her, now drove her into deeper suspicion. How could he remain so unaffected if there was truly nothing wrong? Did his calmness hide secrets, or was her turmoil entirely her own creation? The duality tore her apart. On one hand, she longed to trust him fully, to believe that the bond they had built still held. On the other, she could not silence the voice that whispered of betrayal. The conflict became a kind of double life. Outwardly, she moved through the motions of her days. Inwardly, she was consumed by an investigation without end. The turning point came when she found herself standing in their bedroom, staring at his phone on the nightstand. She had never crossed that line before, never considered prying into his private world. But now, her hand trembled inches above the device, her mind raging with justifications. If there was nothing to find, she would finally have peace. If there was something, at least she would know the truth. Yet she could not bring herself to touch it. The act itself felt like a betrayal, as though in trying to uncover his secrets, she would be creating one of her own. So she stood frozen, caught between desire and restraint, until the sound of the front door opening broke the spell. Adrian entered, carrying the faint scent of rain, his presence filling the space with a kind of ordinary normalcy that made her shame burn hotter. She turned away quickly, pretending to be busy, while inside her heart raced with guilt. But guilt did not stop the cycle. Instead, it deepened it. She began noticing new things, his sudden habit of checking his phone in another room, the way he lingered over messages with the screen angled away. Were these actions deliberate, or simply coincidences magnified by her suspicion. She could no longer tell. Her perception had become a hall of mirrors, each reflection distorting the next, until truth itself seemed impossible to grasp. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, the weight of silence grew unbearable. Adrian chewed quietly, his gaze occasionally meeting hers, but never holding. She studied his face as though it might reveal something hidden beneath the surface. But all she saw was a mask she could not interpret. Her fork clattered softly against the plate, a sound far louder in her ears than it should have been. She wondered if he noticed her trembling hands, or if he was too absorbed in his own thoughts that in moments like this, Elena felt trapped between two abysses. To confront him directly would risk shattering the fragile balance they still maintained. To remain silent would mean sinking deeper into the prison of her own mind. Each option felt like a form of destruction, and yet the choice loomed closer each day. The conflict became not just between her and Adrian, but within herself. Was she unraveling the truth, or was she unraveling herself? Could love survive suspicion, or was suspicion itself a form of betrayal? She thought of her parents' quiet war, of how silence had eroded them long before they admitted it, and she felt a chilling recognition. Something had to give. The silence, once merely oppressive, now felt combustible, like a storm cloud swelling, ready to break. Elena knew it could not last forever. A confrontation was inevitable, though she did not know whether it would bring resolution or ruin. And so she lingered in the growing tension, waiting for the moment when suspicion and silence would finally collide, and the truth, whatever it was, would come to light. The breaking point arrived not with a scream, but with a silence too heavy to bear. It was a Sunday evening, a day that once held meaning for them, when routine slowed and they found time together. But now, the apartment felt colder, the walls too close, the air too dense. Adrian was in the living room, scrolling through his phone with the faintest crease in his brow, while Elena sat at the dining table, staring at the glass of water before her as though it held an answer she could not find. Her heart pounded with a rhythm that seemed to shake her entire body. She told herself, again and again, that she had no proof. And yet, proof had become irrelevant. The absence of certainty was itself unbearable. It was no longer about what Adrian may or may not have done. It was about the way her mind had transformed silence into torment. The words never left her mouth, but the moment was a confrontation nonetheless. Adrian looked up from his phone and found her gaze fixed on him, unblinking, searching. For a long time, they simply stared at each other, a gulf of unspoken questions yawning between them. In that stare, Elena poured every suspicion, every fear, every desperate need for clarity. And in his calm, unreadable expression, she saw either innocence too serene to be false, or guilt too practiced to betray itself. Something inside her fractured. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping the floor in a sound that seemed to slice the silence open. She walked past him without a word, into the bedroom, and closed the door behind her. For a moment, she pressed her back against it, breathing hard, as though she had just escaped something suffocating. But the suffocation was within her, and there was no escape. Her eyes fell again on his phone, lying now on the dresser, charging. It was as though fate itself had placed it before her. She hesitated only briefly this time. Her hand trembled, but she reached for it, the device cool and solid in her palm. With every second, her pulse thundered louder, the act already feeling irreversible. She unlocked it, not with a code she had been told, but one she had guessed, pieced together from years of observing his habits. The ease with which it opened felt like both a violation and a vindication. The screen lit up, revealing his world, and she entered it, as if stepping across a boundary that had once defined trust itself. What she found was not what she had expected. There were no illicit messages, no hidden photographs, no evidence of betrayal. Instead, she found fragments of his solitude, reminders for deadlines, brief exchanges with colleagues, news articles half-read and abandoned. His silence had not been filled with someone else. It had been filled with the weight of his own unspoken struggles. But in the midst of those ordinary traces, she stumbled upon something that chilled her more than any affair could have. A draft email, unsent, written late at night. Its words were not addressed to another woman, nor to a colleague, but to her. It was unfinished, paragraphs scattered, sentences abruptly broken, but its essence was clear. Adrian had been writing, again and again, letters he could not give her. Letters in which he tried to explain his exhaustion, his fears of failing her, his growing inability to bridge the silence between them. He wrote of wanting to be honest, but not knowing how. Of fearing that speaking would only wound her more deeply. Of feeling the weight of her gaze, the suspicion he could not dispel no matter what he said. He confessed, in words never sent, that he loved her still, but that love had become a quiet battle, one he was losing to silence. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she read, her chest tightening with each unfinished line. The betrayal she had feared was not of flesh or fidelity. It was of words left unspoken, of thoughts left caged. And in discovering it, she realized her own betrayal as well. The betrayal of trust, the betrayal of assuming shadows where none existed. The door creaked open behind her. Adrian stood in the frame, his eyes falling on the phone in her hand. For the first time in months, his composure cracked. A flicker of hurt crossed his face, so raw and unguarded that Elena felt it pierce straight through her. The silence that followed was unlike any before. It was no longer a shield, no longer an ambiguity. It was the sound of something breaking, trust, privacy, the fragile fabric that had once bound them. In that moment, they both knew there was no returning to what they had been. Whether they would rebuild or collapse entirely was still uncertain. But the confrontation had come, not through spoken words, but through the exposure of their most hidden truths. Elena dropped the phone onto the bed, unable to meet his eyes. She had sought the truth, and she had found it, but in doing so, she had uncovered something far more devastating than she imagined. Not infidelity, not betrayal by another, but the realization that silence itself had been both their weapon and their wound, and that the battle had already left scars neither of them knew how to heal. The climax of their story was not a revelation of deceit. It was the revelation that their love had been quietly suffocated, not by others, but by themselves. The hours that followed unfolded in a haze, as though time itself had slowed to match the heaviness in the air. Adrian said nothing. Elena, too, remained wordless. They moved through the apartment like two figures inhabiting the same space, but separated by an invisible wall, each step echoing the fracture that had opened between them. Elena returned again and again to the draft she had read, its unfinished words pressing against her like a weight she could not shake. He had been trying, in his own quiet way. He had been wrestling with feelings he did not know how to share. Yet, instead of meeting his silence with patience, she had filled it with suspicion, with imagined betrayals that had poisoned them both. She wanted to believe she had been searching for truth, but what she found instead was herself reflected in the void. Her fears, her insecurities, her relentless need for certainty. Adrian's hurt lingered in the way he avoided her gaze, the way his hands moved slower than usual, deliberate, as though restraining themselves from trembling. Elena recognized the look on his face. It was not anger, not even disappointment, but a profound sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from realizing something precious has been damaged, perhaps beyond repair. They shared a meal that night in near silence. The clinking of utensils was almost unbearable, each sound reminding her of how far they had drifted. She studied him, wanting to reach out, to confess everything, her doubts, her fears, the suffocating noise inside her head. But each time she opened her mouth, the words caught, collapsing into nothing. She feared that speaking them aloud would only confirm the distance she already felt. Later, when Adrian retreated to bed, Elena remained in the living room. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift as she sat there, her mind replaying the choices that had brought them here. She thought of her parents, of the way silence had corroded them until nothing remained but cold civility. She had sworn she would never repeat their mistakes, yet here she was, caught in the same quiet war. Reflection came slowly, painfully. She realized that her obsession with uncovering truth had blinded her to the truth already present. The truth of his quiet devotion, the subtle ways he still reached for her hand, the way he made space for her routines without protest, the letters he wrote in the solitude of his nights. He had not betrayed her, but in doubting him, in prying into his private attempts at vulnerability, she had betrayed both him and herself. Yet it was not a clean betrayal, not the kind that ended things abruptly. Instead, it was the kind that left wounds invisible to outsiders but deeply felt within. It was a rupture that required something neither of them had practiced: openness. The reflection stung her with clarity. Love is not preserved by suspicion nor by silence, but by the courage to be seen in one's weakness. And courage had been absent on both sides. When she finally rose and walked to the bedroom, Adrian was already asleep, his back turned to her. She lay down carefully, staring at the darkness, the space between them stretching like an ocean. She longed to reach across it, but fear held her still. She realized then that the choice ahead of them was no longer about suspicion, no longer about uncovering secrets. It was about whether they could rebuild trust or whether the silence had hollowed them out too deeply to recover. The night passed with that question unanswered, lingering like a shadow that would not lift. Morning arrived without fanfare. The city stirred outside their window, traffic humming, voices rising, but inside the apartment, the atmosphere remained suspended. Elena awoke to find Adrian already gone from the bed, his side cold, the sheets creased. She sat up slowly, the weight of the night before pressing on her chest like a stone. She found him in the kitchen, quietly making coffee. The ordinary act struck her with a painful irony. How normal life could look even when everything beneath it had shifted. He moved with the same steadiness he always had, yet she saw in the set of his shoulders the residue of hurt. He glanced at her briefly, offered the faintest nod, and then turned back to his task. It was then Elena understood the true nature of their crossroad. Love, in its simplest form, had not vanished, but it had been buried, obscured beneath layers of silence, suspicion, and unspoken fear. Whether they could recover it depended not on evidence or proof, but on their willingness to face each other without walls. She wanted to speak, to confess the truth of what she had done, what she had read, what she had feared. She wanted to tell him she had been wrong, not only in doubting him, but in allowing her own insecurities to dictate their life. Yet the words once again faltered on her tongue. Fear still gripped her, fear that speaking would unravel them completely, that his quiet sadness would harden into something permanent. And so, she remained silent. Days passed in this fragile state. They lived beside each other like actors in a play, their roles intact, their lines unspoken. Outwardly, nothing seemed broken. They worked, they shared meals, they exchanged brief words about practical matters. But beneath it all, an unhealed wound lingered. Each day, without acknowledgement, without confrontation, deepened the uncertainty of whether healing was still possible. Elena came to realize that not all stories end with a clear resolution. Some end in this space between, where love is neither lost nor whole, where silence becomes both shield and prison. She began to see that her greatest fear was not that Adrian had betrayed her, but that she had betrayed herself by surrendering to doubt instead of courage. The truth she sought had not been hidden in his actions, but in her own reflection. She had looked for shadows outside when the real shadows had always been within. One evening, as she sat by the window watching the city lights flicker, she thought of the draft emails again. They were his silent attempt at honesty, his way of reaching for her when words failed him. And she wondered, if she could not meet him there, if she could not summon the courage to answer silence with openness, then what was left? Perhaps their story would continue, perhaps it would fade. But either way, it had already left its mark, a reminder that love cannot survive on perception alone, that trust must be fed not by suspicion, but by vulnerability. That in the end, Elena understood that the most shocking betrayals are not acts committed by others, but the quiet ways in which we abandon ourselves. And with that realization, she remained at the window, the night pressing close around her, the city alive beyond the glass, and silence, always silence, filling the space between what was and what might never be again. The end.